Oh, great. Yes, hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and to those who came from out of town, thank you for being here. It's much appreciated. And hello to those on the digital ether known as Instagram, I think. I don't know. Where's it being streamed? Instagram? Okay, hi Instagram. Thanks for joining, and thank you for checking out my work. As you may have already known, my name's Khaleel, and I'm really grateful to Factory Media Center for giving me the opportunity to really experiment with different forms of media and for the public exhibition of my work. And I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about my work and how I really try to merge film and theater practices together into my process of creation. So who is this guy? Let's just get this out of the way. So as you probably know, Christina would have just told you, I'm Khaleel. I'm a filmmaker, stage manager, mixed media artist. I have multiple different portfolios. As those of you who know me know, I never really stop working on very many different things. I graduated in 2021 for the master. I'm an independent contractor. I do marketing, theater, video filming, editing, photography, etc. Born and raised in Collingwood, but I, of course, spent 4+ years here in Hamilton for school and other things. I've made artwork and theater in this city for many years, and I also work in Barrie as well at Theatre by the Bay doing theater, stage managing, marketing, those sorts of things there. A little bit more about what I do. Well, I've been making videos and producing since the early days of high school in Collingwood, Ontario, where, you know, it's a small town, so it was certainly an interesting time there. But I first fell in love with making films in high school, and then since then I've expanded to try out short films, documentaries, experimental and anti-narrative films. Most recently, my anti-narrative film that I completed for my thesis 2 years ago. I've also gotten into the theater world, so I'm a producer. I've managed stages there, and I do a bit of corporate video editing and short trailer and commercial work, just on the side, just for fun. Most recently, my work, actually upcoming, I have a documentary coming out in 5 weeks, which is mildly terrifying, but also very exciting. I've also recently completed an education masterclass video series, and as I mentioned, my thesis project is entitled Convergence, and that was completed in 2021, in the old days of COVID. Just a couple of works to get out of the way. These are some examples of my work. These first 2 photos that you'll see here are from my Convergence series. It's an exploration of the relationship with the land and the South Asian diaspora, and explores tension between religion, race, and the Western culture we live in. Here's another photo. There's the Collingwood terminals. If anyone is ever up in Collingwood, it's a real sight to see there. It's not. It's been closed for a while, so you know. I like to say that it's a fancy thing, but it's not. What else we got here? This is a snapshot from my Convergence 3. There are 3 works in that series. This was from a experimental film. It was a series of 4, and that was playing around with different objects and layering, which, as you'll soon see, or you might have seen in there, is something that I've continued to try and play around with. This is a Joiner photograph. You can't see it because the text is not the right color for accessibility, my bad. This is called Convocation Dance. It's from school days in 2020. Black and White Rail Over is a project I'm going to return to. This is a theater film hybrid production that will lead nicely into some of the things I'm going to talk about later. And then 20 Years by the Bay is the upcoming documentary. And this is some other examples of my work: corporate, film, theater, short trailers, educational content, all that stuff. That is basically me in a nutshell. Now the real reason you're here, I'm assuming, my area of interest as an artist is exploring how the world of theater and film and video can blend. A lot of this is through intermedia projects, and what I like to try and explore is figure out how the connections between both worlds can exist or not exist, and this can be in both narrative films, and it can be in anti-narrative projects, like sort of what you saw in the gallery if you've had a chance to take a look. For example, Black and White Rail Over, that theater film hybrid I just mentioned, that was a narrative project that blended theater and film in the same production. It changed from scene to scene, from film to theater, back to film. And then this one over here is a bit more, that one was a bit more of an obvious sort of interplay between the two. But I'm also interested in exploring the connections that are less obvious, like practices, disciplines, ways of working that you might not exactly see at first glance on projects that might come from theater, but they show up in a video. I'll talk about some of those less obvious connections about the work that you saw in the gallery. What else is here? Oh yes, and also I'm interested in expanding the collaborative process. I'm not a believer that film, theater, media, art is made by one person sitting on a chair and saying, this is what I want and here's how you're going to do it. I'm really interested in expanding the collaborative process to really create a flow of ideas that happen between team members, while still maintaining some sort of structure, because if it's too much of discussion and not enough action, then nothing gets anywhere, which I will dive into shortly. A little bit about the Open Studio. So I think most of you have seen the work, maybe not in its entirety, but I'll give you an exclusive expansion of what you might have seen on the postcards that you would have seen. So this is the Open Studio. So as Christina sort of mentioned, this residency was made to develop works in progress for a future exhibition. And what I really wanted to do was explore new ideas of form through camera gear, specifically double exposures. I also wanted to gain new experience in making decisions on installation and exhibitions, because this is my first in real life, in-person exhibition. I did one in, what was the year that I graduated? 2021. I did a virtual one then, but nothing in person. So this is a new adventure for me and a very exciting one with that. And I've also been looking to refine and enhance devising-based method of creation, and that's a word that we're going to come back to shortly. This is on the back of your card, and I'm just going to leave it up here in case you want to read it. But the central theme and idea that I'm exploring in this exhibition has to do with the fascia, and basically it's a really fascinating, it's a fascinating light read if you have insomnia or something. But basically the idea goes that there's this connective tissue that supports all of our major organs, bones, nervous system, called the fascia, and it lives underneath our bodies. So it's underneath the skin, and it just is interconnecting all of the parts of our body. That's the hard research. Now the soft research, or sort of the more speculative things, that is just a theory and not necessarily true. Some research suggests that emotions can be stored in the fascia, and so what it really started out with this question of we often hear, when you go through something painful, or you go through something that has a lasting impact on you, we're often like, oh, there must be a lot going on with that person that we don't see. I'm sure that's a quote on Pinterest or something. But I actually wondered if that was true, if that had science behind that. And it started with this idea of can this emotional energy be stored in our body, and it dove deep into fascia. So as I mentioned, it's kind of like this spider web that connects all of our internal organs and major nervous system, connectivity to major organs, bones, nerve fibers, that sort of thing. But what that has to do with storing emotional energy, well, that's an interesting read, and I won't give you all of this, but there's a theory that when you go through something traumatic, that energy gets stored in a part of your body in the fascia, and you may not know that it's there. You may just be fine, just like living your life, and then it will manifest itself in different ways. Memories aren't just stored in the brain, they're also stored in our body. And specifically, the theory goes that it's stored in the fascia. So it's kind of think of it like a clump that's stuck to your body. If it's gone unaddressed, it can manifest and grow and grow and grow until it gets out of control and you have to do something about it. It's the same sort of thing with fascia. Emotional pain can manifest and get stuck in your body, and then that can eventually lead to physical pain, like aches, pains, things like that, or mental effects like depression, brain fog, those sorts of ideas. Things can get stuck in the fascia, and if you have unresolved wounds that you're dealing with, they can get stuck in your body, and that can show up in different ways. There's also the potential that fascia can hold memories or fragments of events. I'm sure everyone's gone through something that they'd like to forget about. And what our brain tends to do is take those memories and then distort them, so we don't have to experience the full thing over and over and over again. But those distortions can get lodged in the fascia. So, you know, if you have scars that come from, say, like a heartbreak, a loss, you know, you have those scars emotionally in the fascia just like you would a scar if you were riding a bike and fell off and scraped your knee. Same sort of idea, just all of it underneath the surface of our skin. I'll end it with this sort of quote that I found when I was reading. I don't know if anyone's ever gone to a chiropractor's appointment. If not, this anecdote may not make any sense to you, but think of it like, you know, you've just experienced some sort of release from your body. Maybe you've like gone for a run. Maybe you've like seen a friend that you haven't seen in a while. Maybe you've actually gotten like physical therapy. And some patients will actually start to break down and cry because a specific area of their body has just released something deep inside that they didn't even know was there. And that, the theory goes, is fascia. And that is facial tension being released. And that's sort of what I'm interested in this exhibition, which is very exciting. So that's the theory part of it, and then of course the content, as I mentioned, is double exposure. So for those of you who don't know what a double exposure is, it's basically a superimposition of two images on the same layer to create a single photo. I did not take that photo, that's just from Google. But you may have seen something similar to these on like movie posters and things like that, right? That's photography, and then in video, this could mean an imposition of one clip onto another. I'm hoping that people have at least played with iMovie here in some, you know, fun capacity. You know, you play around with the opacity and you create like two images side by side. That's what the basics are, but I wanted to expand the scope of this. What you see in that photo is a carefully edited Photoshop file that has been made to look really nice and pretty, and there are no edges, and it looks like it's a seamless double exposure. Not interesting, not to me anyways. What I wanted to do was to explore in-camera double exposure. So basically, the double exposure is created in the camera. You don't edit it, you don't touch it. You have to physically set up your shots so that the finished product comes out as the double exposure you want. No editing, no tweaking, none of this Photoshop stuff. Why I wanted to do that was I wanted to create a sense of immediacy. It's not clean like the example on the right. There are distortions, there are things that are disjointed. You may have seen some of the photos in there. They're not exactly clean cuts. And I think that that's an interesting way to explore the immediacy and more realistic elements of the double exposures. And then video installations, I wanted to explore videos beyond just changing an opacity on the clip. I wanted to play again with like the immediacy of having a projection over top of a video, and what meaning does that have to it. That is the really fast Cole's Notes version of what you just saw, or what you will see in the open studio. And now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process in which that came together. So, as I mentioned at the top of the show, what I'm really interested in is using devising to expand and enhance the creative process. Now, devising may be a bit of a weird term for some of the non-theater people in the room, so I'll explain that in detail. But we're basically going to go through, you know, what is devising. I'm going to talk about my creation process. And I'm going to talk about how devising may be applicable in film, in experimental film, in narrative film even, and how we can sort of think of it like a collaboration between like practices for theater. We can use them in film in different ways, and we can actually enhance the process, which is kind of cool. And then some parting thoughts for consideration at the end. So this is a quote from a theater reviewer and theater critic. I think it's an interesting quote that I'm going to come back to, I think, in this process. He says, devising is a process in which the whole creative team develops a show collaboratively. From actors to technicians, everyone is involved in the creative process. The big thing about devising, for those who don't know what it is devising is collaborative. Again, it's not just this director who sat on their chair and wants to point the actors to go in this way and which way other. In a lot of senses, you know, I think there's sort of this, in my observation anyway, in theater anyways, there's this shift away from that sort of top-down hierarchy of direction and collaboration. And we're opening up the space a bit more to get an open flow of ideas, thoughts, choices. It comes from the world of theater, as I mentioned, and it's been on the rise a bit more recently. So some common things that you might see with devising. I hope you enjoy this little image there. So when you're devising, let's say you're working on a show, right? Often, but not always, and I'm talking about theater, and we'll get into film and video soon. Often, but not always, you're starting from Nothing. And I say that in quotations because normally there's some sort of idea that you have. But you're starting on an empty page. Maybe you don't have a script. I don't know. Maybe you do have like the bones of a script, but it's not a script. It's not nearly ready for production. It doesn't mean nothing per se. It could be a question. This open studio started with a question. It was just a question. That's all I had to start on this. And my application, which I wrote 5 weeks before, and I forgot what I said. So it was just a question. It can be a terrifying prospect for some people. It was for me. But as the sign says, don't let an empty page stop you from doing something. Because the devising comes from just taking the plunge. And it also comes from uniting a team around a purpose. It doesn't matter if it's a team of 2, it doesn't matter if it's a team of 20. When you're devising, you are uniting people around a purpose. And the purpose isn't like, let's make this show happen. The purpose is more so, let's investigate this question. My question for the Open Studio was, can emotional energy be stored underneath our skin and parts of the body? That was it. That was the only question that I had. And then thanks to Olivia, who's back there, who's my actress and model in the work, we worked to answer that question through the work, through devising. We united around this common purpose to have that, to come up with an answer to that question, and an answer, your answer will be different than my answer. That's the beauty of art. But we were united around that common purpose. Devising also brings a lot of freedom and flexibility to explore subjects with less constraints. And so what I mean by that is you're not always working in a space where like the show is in 3 weeks and you got to just get it done because the show is going to happen and you have to be ready for it. You're not necessarily, because there are obviously exceptions to this rule, you're not necessarily just like getting it done because you got to get it done. You're spending more time to explore things, let ideas percolate, and you're not so worried about like, the show's in 3 weeks, so I need to make the right decision as a performer, or as a director, I need to make the right call about this person, otherwise the show will be bad. You're having more time and the flexibility to explore new ideas. You're also deconstructing conventional methods of theater production. This is less so relevant in my work, but it is an important thing to talk about in direction. As I mentioned, that top-down hierarchy of production is sort of, it's shifting in the theater world. We're taking a more collaborative approach to projects. We're seeing less and less of those sort of tyrannical directors who want to dictate their process and not give any room for feedback or opinion or examples. And the most important thing that I had to remind myself is that sometimes in devising, your ideas are shit. Your ideas are just shit. And that's just the way it is. Like sometimes your ideas will be absolutely shit. And it'll make you wonder, it makes me wonder why I'm even doing this. I'm just throwing things at a wall and hoping they stick. Now, it's controlled chaos, but I'm still throwing things at a wall. But devising is working with, for me anyways, devising is working with as few constraints as possible. No idea is a bad idea. You throw it and see if it sticks. Most of them will be bad. But then there'll be that one glimmer of an idea, that one thread, that you'll be like, oh, actually, that's interesting. Maybe I'll follow it. And you sort of repeat the process for as much as you can in your creative process. Now, an important caveat to make, this is from the hit show, Whose Line Is It Anyway? It's a famous improvisation show. I hope you've all watched it, it's hilarious. But again, the premise is basically they do these improv games, and it's very funny, and I guess everyone has a good time. An important caveat to make is that sometimes I've heard that there's this I've heard people mistake improvisation for devising. And from my perspective, devising can sometimes involve improvisation exercises to warm people up, to get people into character, that sort of thing, like the classic, Whose Line Is It Anyway? But devising is not solely improvisation. Devising goes beyond that. You're not just like getting actors together and playing improv games because it's fun and let's crack the ice. You're having discussion, you're exploring things, you're feeding them prompts and trying things, and you're failing, and it's not working, but you're going to continue to try these things anyways because you need to investigate the thread that you're going to. So for example, a classic improvisation game from this show is called Scenes from a Hat, where basically everyone pulls out a prompt from a hat and they go act out the scene for everyone. And it's hilarious and it's very funny, and the prompts are often obscene and very stilted to get a certain reaction. But that's an example of improvisation, an improvisation game, versus devising what I like to do, and you'll see a little bit of this later, I believe, is I like to just go in with as blank of a slate as possible, and I'll give, for example, with Olivia, what I would do is I would give her a task. I would give her a business, like you're writing a letter. And then I would feed her different prompts to see how she would take those directions and how she would respond to those prompts. It's not so much, give me a funny line from a show, it's more so, what happens if this happens, and how do you feel as a result of it? And now you're going to see, I did say, and now you're going to see these prompts in action here. Don't know how the sound's going to work, so I may repeat some of the prompts that I've given just so you can hear it. But basically, this process was a lot of doing these sessions. Sitting Olivia down in front of camera and having her do a task and giving her prompts and seeing how she reacted. This first one was early on in the process, like early in March. Very early in March. And the scene is that she's writing a letter to somebody. I don't know who it is, she's just writing a letter.
A stranger is looking at you or staring at you. That's making you uncomfortable.
So the prompt there was a stranger was looking at you or staring at you as making you uncomfortable. And I would shut up, and I would just watch and see what happened. So during this, I would be sitting there with my notepad making notes on reactions. And I wouldn't be writing like, is this a good reaction or a bad reaction? But I would just write down observations. What I liked, what I didn't like, what was interesting, what was not interesting. This is from a couple weeks later. Now we've introduced the string, which if you've seen the exhibition, you'll know that the string plays a pretty significant role in all of these works. So now we've introduced the string. So here's another example of a prompt that I gave her.
Material scares you.
So the prompt was the material scares you, for those on the Instagram. Similar sort of idea. I would watch that, and I think I remember from that one, I was like, Olivia, that reaction was too big. I don't like it. But then we talked about it, and we were like, don't use this. But this part was interesting. Maybe refine it so it's more of a subtle reaction. It's not so much of a physical reaction. It's more of a look. It's more of a glance. It's more of a body shift, so to speak. And so we would continue that process over and over and over again. And between each devising session, I would come up with new prompts, I would refine what worked, I would refine what didn't work, and then that eventually culminated in what you will see in the space there, which is a clip, and this is the final clip from that.
We're revisiting a place from your previous relationship.
The prompt was, we're revisiting a place from your previous relationship. The rest of it you can see on the wall in there. But anyways, that would be the process for those projections. And throughout that process, we'd have constant conversations about what did you think about this? What was your reaction to this? How did you feel about this? And from there, we came up with a through line, or a lack of a through line rather, for the story, and I'll come back to sort of those beats in a second. But what I want to do before I get there, though, is note that while what you just saw was a devising process with an actor, devising processes, or the principle of devising anyways, can also be applied to technical elements and technical experimentation. You can use technology to throw things at a wall, explore new ideas without the pressure of getting it right, and then refine and process what you're doing to get to an end result. So this is a photo of a shoreline that is near my house, that is near my town, that I took in November of 2020, and this was when I was working on my thesis, and I was struggling, as you do when you're doing a thesis. And I was just taking photos. This was for a proof of concept. I was just taking photos. At the time, I sort of knew that I wanted to do like a photo series in the thesis. Didn't exactly know what it was going to look like. I was just playing with the camera, and I was just exploring spaces. And what I was interested in at the time, I knew I wanted to explore tension, but I didn't know how that worked. And at the time, I looked for spaces that were between sort of two different elements that were like squished in. And I would go around my house and my town, and I would look for these places. And then eventually I did like a 180-degree turn. And I think I used that same location, but I did a joiner photograph, which is basically like a composited image. It's a long scope, but basically it's a composite image full of different frames. Same location, just portrayed in a different light. And then I submitted that for my proof of concept, and then I promptly was like, that does not work. And I threw it out. Not threw it out, I just shelved it for perhaps a future iteration of the project. But then this right here is the finished product. So from that process of going from this space is interesting to what if I broke up the space into all these things to what if I kept the space the same but then put myself there, I was able to refine and enhance my process until I got something that I was happy with and I was happy to submit. That was also the process we did with this exhibition. So with the double exposures, I had no idea how in-camera double exposures worked. Not a clue. I knew that you could do them, but I had no idea how it worked. And so one day I was like, Olivia, I'm going to take a photo of you, and I'm going to take a photo of this tripod, and I'm going to see what happens. And obviously the results are just bad. I wouldn't use that for anything. But then I said, okay, what if you stand in the same spot, but this time I'm going to keep the camera in the exact same plane, the exact same level, not change it, you just move. And so I said, okay, well that's interesting, maybe I'll muck around and see what sticks. And then I tried a long exposure, and I was like, okay, what if you sit down, and I'm going to take a very long photograph, and I'm going to impose that on another photograph, and see what happens. And at this point, I had sort of gotten the idea that there's something here, maybe it's worth exploring, maybe it's not. I was interested in this sort of like dual face effect, but something else it wasn't feeling right. It wasn't working. Then I introduced the string. And in some early experimentations with double exposure string, we both were sort of like, a lot of this looks like horror stuff. This looks scary, and this is not exactly the intended effect that we're going for. But this was the first time, and this is it's a little hard to see, but this was the first time that I noticed this disjointed effect that comes from doing in-camera double exposure and not touching things up in Photoshop. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. There's some tension there. That's sort of fascinating, and I want to keep that. I want to keep it more immediate. And then, as you may have seen in the exhibition there, this is one of the final ones that ended up on the wall. So you'll notice I started from this, not usable photo, let's say. I kept the dual face feature that's in the early photos. I got rid of the long exposure one. We refined Olivia's outfit and Olivia's posing and Olivia's hair, and we refined the placement of the string, and then we got a final image like that. So again, while this isn't devising in the truest sense of the word, the underlying fundamentals are still there. You're refining things, you're trying things, you're seeing what works, you're eliminating things that don't work, and you keep repeating that until you get something that works for your project. So this is all great. This is all great and dandy, Khaleel. What does this mean if I'm working on a show? What does it mean if I'm working on a project? How should I go about working on these things? Well, a couple notes. The important thing to remember about devising is that because it fosters a collaborative environment, you should not be precious with ideas. Don't hold on to ideas. The best idea wins. There were a couple of times, when I was struggling with an idea and Olivia would pitch me something and I'd be like, I don't think that works. But then occasionally she'd pitch me something and I'm like, yes, that's exactly what we're going for. Don't be precious about ideas. The devising allows us collaboration so that everyone can sort of pitch in with their own thoughts and their own ideas, and you can get to the best idea for the project. That being said, not every idea should make it to finals, and I think there should be someone that has the final say that says, this is great, but I'm making a call about this. And there were a couple times when I was like, Olivia, this is a great idea, but it doesn't work for this. We're going with this. And that's okay too, because we've had that space to talk about ideas. But as I mentioned earlier, if there's no structure at all, then nothing will ever get done, and it'll just keep spinning and spinning and spinning. And I've been in a couple of those situations, and not great. As a lead artist, or I'm assuming you're a lead artist, but this is how I work. As a lead artist, you set the roadmap and let the performers explore ideas from that. I call them guideposts. So for Olivia, in the performance videos, we kept exploring, and eventually through that exploration, we found out beats that she would hit. We identified these specific beats, these targets that she would hit. And I said, I want to see all of these things in the final product. But how you get there, or why you get there, could change, right? It could be a slightly different track that you take to get to that point. As long as you hit that point, that's what I'm looking for. So, particularly in anti-narrative or experimental stuff, and we'll get to narrative in a second, particularly in those types of works, set the guideposts and trust the actors. Trust the people you're working with to get there, and let them explore how they get there, as long as they hit those points, so that you can still have the structure there. I'm also a big believer that devising helps hone your and your team's instincts when it comes to working on a project. And that there are things that you won't be able to fully rationalize, but you'll just know are right. Working off of instinct is a hard thing to do. I still can't do it most of the time. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. But as soon as you accept that there are some things that you won't be able to logically justify, but emotionally it just feels right, things get a lot easier. Because we are humans, right? We are emotional human beings, and sometimes the beauty of art is we see some things and we're just like, I don't understand why this makes me feel a certain way, but it makes me feel a certain way. And your brain will never be able to figure it out. But as an artist, if I lean into that, then that can perhaps lead to some interesting results. For example, a little insider information. This photo was never meant to originally be in the exhibition. This was a photo that was taken during early experimentation, way back at the beginning of April. This was weeks before production was meant to start. And I looked at this photo after a couple of days of shooting it, and I just knew it had to be in the exhibition somehow. I didn't know exactly why. I didn't have a logical explanation for it, but something felt right about this piece. Even though this was weeks before production, this was weeks before I had refined sort of the lighting and the position of the camera and what she's wearing and all those things. I knew I had to include it because it just works. So that's a fun thing for me because I've never really done that before. But also it goes to show you sometimes following your instincts can lead to things that work. And you might not think it works, and that's totally fine. But for me, something about this photo, I knew I had to include it in the work. Now, can devising processes that are traditionally in theater be applied to filmmaking and video production? Now, this may not necessarily mean the full performance of your film needs to be a devised piece, not necessarily. But the practices and collaboration can certainly happen. So added development time. What they call it in film is staging or blocking, sort of similar to theater, but they use the word staging for some reason. I don't know. Staging is normally when the director gets the actors and says, okay, you go here and you walk here and you do this on this line and whatever, right? What I would offer and what I hope to explore through future films is adding some development time, where we do have time for more devising, we do have more time for exploration, we have time for character exercises, to get actors more into their bodies and more into their physicalities. And I just said devising exercises. So, these aren't improvisation games. They aren't meant to break the ice. They aren't meant to, relieve some tension on the set, right? They're more about getting into character, physicality, tone. All those things are important for actors and performers. And I think for film actors, that is still true. Even though film and theater are different acting worlds, those fundamentals, in my experience, are similar. Devising can also inform character and blocking choices. All you need is a moment. One moment in what I call a sea of no's. There have been times in this process with Olivia where we did 20 minutes of devising. 19 of those minutes were not usable. And I didn't like them. And I didn't want them, and it didn't work. But there was 1 minute where she made a choice that I was like, that's interesting, we need to hold on to that. And it only takes a moment. Now, of course, it's sort of a catch-22. Like, you can't spend 3 hours devising necessarily on a film set, but you never know what you can explore, what you can find through devising. And then, of course, it opens the collaboration process a bit more, less of a top-down hierarchy situation, and more of collaboration, because everyone's got ideas, and the best idea should win. And so you might be thinking, well, clearly that's great for experimental and anti-narrative stuff, that makes sense, but what about my favorite film? What about my favorite short film? It's a narrative, it's got a beginning, middle, and end, it's got all these things that, it's a traditional story. What happens then? And my response to that is fair enough, obviously it's going to be different, but I think elements from the devising processes can be useful. Devising can still assist you with character development and discovery. Like, you can still run these exercises so that actors can discover more about their characters, even if they have like a clear arc in the script. Like, maybe they develop a tic of some sort. Maybe they have a habit that is not in the script, but you find out through devising that would actually help the characterization of this person, right? An established script doesn't necessarily mean that discoveries can't be made. Scripts are mostly a fluid document, in my experience. Now, don't tell Mervish that, because they might sue you for copyright. But scripts can change. Scripts do change. There are things that, we hear stories of actors improvising things all the time on set because it just makes sense for them. And they made it into the final cut, right? So discoveries can still be made through devising, and you still can modify things on a film set. Now, when the camera rolls, obviously devising doesn't need to be the focus. Like, I don't expect that films will roll the camera and then you'll do a fun devising exercise for 20 minutes to explore the character. You'll have a track that you'll follow, but it's all that work that happens before the camera rolls. That is what I think can be useful to take away from devising. And of course, entertain ideas, but maintain a hierarchy. Of course, there doesn't need to be someone who makes the final call at the end of the day. Ideas are great, collaboration is great, but someone has to stand up and say, I'm the director, we're doing this, thank you so much for all your ideas, these are great, but we're going with this route. Some final parting considerations to leave you with. And these are things that I'm also working through in my own practice, in my own way of producing and making art. Devising can often lengthen the production process. So, time and money are a thing. More development, more time with actors often means more money. But I'm not suggesting that this process that I'm pitching needs to be a week long. It doesn't necessarily need to be a week long. If you have first-rate actors, you maybe need a day, an extra day, where you set aside some time to do some character work and devising and exploration of your character. Flies here, sorry. Don't know where they came from. Even again, a day or two can really lend itself to developing character and story. So yes, it's a bit more money if you're paying people to show up for an extra day. But I think the results can sometimes be well worth it. You might also be thinking, well, clearly there's different kinds of acting between theater and film. And I'd say, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying that you have to act for the stage on film. But again, devising can still exist on film. There are groups in Hamilton that actually have been working on this. Agile Arts comes to mind, where they take some of the principles of devising in theater and they transfer it to the film, and they see what they can do to modify it for that medium. Devising is a lot about exploration, working off of instincts, and those are things that you can take into the film world. You don't have to be a theater actor in order to explore your instincts and just explore in general. and then this is probably, you've probably heard me say this before, but if everyone has a voice, who makes the decisions, Khaleel? Well, you have to keep a decision maker, keeper of the story. That will help with that. And then the process can't be too open-ended. So I talked about guideposts. I also call them lampposts. So when you're fumbling around in the dark, like I would do in this process of the residency, I would identify the lampposts. I would identify those posts that I'm working towards, that I know I want to be in there in some way, and then I would allow myself the time to continue to fumble around in the dark while I make these guideposts. And you have to try and maintain a middle ground between those two things. But fumbling around in the dark while it can be scary can also lead to really rewarding results. Well, I've talked to you enough for this fine evening. I mean, that's sort of my way of working. That's sort of what I would offer to you. If you're an artist, or if you're an artist on Instagram, and you're looking at expanding your creative processes, I hope this may be worth a bit of morsel of your time. Because this is a work in progress exhibition, I would appreciate what you thought on the work that you saw. There's a QR code up there you can scan to keep in touch and also fill out your thoughts. It's also on the back of your postcard. If you don't have a postcard, they're over here. And you can also keep in touch on my website, KhaleelGandhi.com. And with that, I end my speech. And I open the floor for questions if anybody has questions. Any questions, or are we all too hot and uncomfortable? Because I also, Chris.
Khaleel, thanks for your talk. Congratulations on your residency and your show. As I was wandering around looking at the images in the gallery, I was tuning into these references to like Webb's Cat's Cradle, and made me think of this notion of tension, which you mentioned a number of times in your talk, visual tension, etc. And I'm thinking about tension in terms of like positive meaning, something that's ready, something that's tuned, it's negative connotations, anxiety, fear. And I'm thinking about those two sides of the coin in terms of the creative process and in terms of how you work. And I'm wondering, how do you manage that? Because too much tension, too little tension, things just fall apart, right? So when you're sort of like, facilitating these exchanges, how do you manage that balance between the positive and negative?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and one that I admittedly am continuing to work on. I think what devising does that I didn't mention in this presentation actually, which is thanks for prompting this. For me as an artist, what leading devising allows me to do is really sit in the room and focus exactly on what this person is doing. Not on anything else. I'm not thinking about any other things that I have to photograph or things that I need to do for this other job that I have. I'm in the room with an actor and I'm focused exactly on what they're doing. And a lot of that managing of positive and negative tension for me just comes down to instinct. If I'm locked in, if I'm dialed, and if I'm focusing on exactly on what this person is doing, oftentimes that sort of yin and yang management will sort of come naturally. Like there will be times where there were times when I let Olivia just like run a path, even though I knew it was too long. I knew the beat was too long, but I wanted to see what she would do. Versus times where I've cut beats short because I've recognized in the moment that this is not going to work, and this is not a process that we're going to continue because it's not going to work. So it's being present in the room, being present with your own sort of gut instinct there, and also I think like. Well, what Olivia and I would do and what I've done in previous projects is also having a conversation about it. I find having a conversation about what we just did and what we just discovered really helps recenter yourself in the work, and also like for me as a creator, it allows me to check myself and say like, did I lean too heavily into the world of like stoic film acting here? Like, should I push her a bit more, or did I allow for too much devising? Do I need to shorten it? So I would say those are the two things that I found have worked for me so far. Of course, it's a continuous work in progress, but that's my offer on managing those two things. Any other? I think Ava, yeah.
How did you pick what you were gonna like tell her to do? Like, did you kind of have like a pre-done list, and did they follow a theme, or was it just kind of like a list off the internet?
Yeah, great question. So all of them were original prompts that I made up from this little login here. And I really tried to avoid giving obvious prompts of like, well, okay, that's not true. There were some obvious prompts because they were necessary. But they weren't all obvious prompts. They weren't all just like, you've just broken up with a partner, or like, your dog just died, right? Like that's not really what I'm going for. There were times when I would try to push her towards the abstract, like, this, you're afraid of this string. And it's like, what do you mean? It's string. How could I possibly be afraid of this string? But it was pushing Olivia to think more abstract about what the string represents, as opposed to like, this string can't hurt me, why am I scared of it? So it was like, it took a lot of just sort of sitting there and like mulling over, what is the intended effect I'm looking for, and what's a question that I can craft that sort of gets her there without being too obvious. And as the process went on, the questions kept changing. Even in production for the final finished pieces, there were occasions where I'd thrown a wild card for Olivia to respond to that I'd never asked before, because I wanted to explore an intended effect. So it was a lot of like seeing what questions work, seeing what questions landed, and also like, again, through that discussion afterwards, Olivia would say like, I didn't really understand this question, it doesn't make any sense. And I'd be like, okay, well, do I need to change the question, or do I need to reframe the direction I'm giving? Yeah, but they were all from this little brain here. Yeah.
Okay. I have two, but if I forget the second one, then that's fine.
Okay.
So
You know where to find me, I'm sure we can.
Yes, indeed. So yeah, like, my question is, yes, you're correct in that the devising process, while it's not a new concept, it's certainly one that has taken hold of just like the performing arts in general. Like, more and more people are just on that bandwagon in one capacity or another, and there's a lot of bastardization of it, like people using it but not really, and that's fine.
Indeed.
So in all, I guess my question is like, where do you think the intersectionality is between honoring a devised process in the world of corporate production? Because at the end of the day, like, people do have deadlines to meet. The writer knows the story that they want to tell. All of that has already happened months, if not years, in advance of the actors getting in the room. So, where do you think the power really lies in the devisers then? Because if it's like you throw them something and like something magical and powerful is born out of that, but what if it's not in the script that was already approved? You know what I mean? What does it then just become sort of a grown-up daycare for actors where they were allowed to do their best work and indulge their souls, but at the end of the day, it's all going to be snuffed out?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and one that I sort of have pondered back and forth. And I don't know that I have a straight answer for you, because it is complex, and I find that it will probably depend on the project and the team that you're working with. As I mentioned earlier, like, the chances of you like adding in a character tick for I just saw Harry Potter yesterday, so I'm going to use Harry Potter and the Cursed Child as a reference. The chances of you adding in a character tick for the main character of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child probably fairly low, because it's a commercial play. It's been done the same way for God knows how many years. You never know, the director may be game for it, but there's a less chance of that happening than, for example, in like an indie theater where the script is new, for example, and the actors' feedback is welcome as part of that process. I would say my answer to that is, I think it comes down to managing expectations and also allocating time, right? I think the amount of time you allocate for such a thing can sort of impact that. For example, let's say I was working on a murder show, hypothetically. Maybe I would give half a day for a bit of character exploration because I was interested in like finding a character tick or something, and that's it. And then the rest of the 3 weeks or the 4 weeks of rehearsal is just by the book. Here's what we're doing. This is what it is. That creates a different expectation for actors Versus like a new show like you and I have worked on, for example, like a new show where it's like, no, we'll spend like 3 full days of devising. You will get a chance to like have that time to like play around and mess around, and then we will use some of that in the script. So it's not a straight answer, I don't think, and it's not like a clear sort of, here's the divide between like the corporate world and the world in which you can devise. But I think managing expectations, and I think, again, allocating the amount of time that's appropriate for what the project is will sort of help with that, and will give actors a chance to engage in some of that work, because from most actors I know, like, find some interest in doing such things. Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure. It's not simple, but that's sort of what I would offer there. Do you know what the second question was?
Yeah, I was panicking, but I remember. Okay. So I'm fascinated by this, like what you touched on of basically for you, kind of like that linchpin or that golden nugget of like how do we bring theater practices into film and photography and stuff, and it's the idea of immediacy, right? Like that is the difference. Like yes, theater is very well rehearsed, but at the end of the day, it's about real people in the flesh doing something for the first time, and who knows what's going to happen. So I guess my question is like, all right, in this piece, in this exhibit that you've created, you've been able to channel that, but everything is still packaged and static and finished. So what's next? Like how do you push that idea farther?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think you're sort of touching on something that will always be the case with film and photography, is that there always will be a little bit of finish to it. Like those photos in there, matte finishing. I don't know if you know squat about printing, matte finishing. It's a finish. It allows for less light, like there's less reflection off of the photos with the matte finish. But it's still finished. And there was, while I didn't Photoshop anything, I did like tweak the highlights and the contrast and then put it up, right? So there is always going to be a little bit of like that lack of immediacy that you get from theater, where if someone messes up their line, like they mess up their line, and that's just the way it is. I think how to sort of get beyond that would be very much so like pushing further towards more abstraction, pushing towards less finish on photos. If I take the photo this way with the lighting the way it is, then that's it. And that's the only thing that I'm going to do, and I'm going to print it, and that's about it. And I was sort of trying to get there with the performance videos. There was no color correction on it, there was no props, there was no shiny color grade on it. It's just the way in which, how we shot it is what you see, and that's even reflected in sort of the setting of it. How I might push it further, well, I mean, live installation work, you know, that's sort of a thought that I did have, and actually insider information. I'd once thought, maybe I'll have Olivia do a bit of this live for the for your viewing, but then I explained that idea. But that is an example of something more immediate, where perhaps what you're seeing is recorded live as you're watching it, and then it gets projected on a wall somewhere else, right? So you get more of that immediacy that you get from the world of theater. Any other questions before we wrap things up? Great. Well, thank you again so much for coming. I really, really appreciate those of you who came from far or near, and those of you who tuned in on Instagram, hello. Thank you for watching me speak. I'll stick around for a bit if you want to chat, and I'd love to make plans with some of you that I haven't seen in a while. But again, please, if you can take a moment to fill out your feedback, and of course check out the work and the space, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you. And thank you.